Probably Baez's most important component to her political activism career was her work during the war in Vietnam and the peace movement. Her and her former husband David Harris led this, and Steve Earle shares, when she was doing the protests against the draft, she would go to Oakland, she would go to the terminal where they were loading the guys, the recruits, to go to the training, and she would stand there and say, "You don't have to do this. We have lawyers, we have advisors who can show you how to not try and become part of this. This is a bad thing." And they would spit at her and kick at her and curse at her and call her every name under the sun, and she would keep trying. Every once in a while, she'd manage to pull a guy out of the line, and they'd arrest her and take her down and throw her in jail. And she'd spend a couple of nights in jail, and then she'd get out, and she'd go home, and she'd take a shower and have a meal, and go right back to Oakland and stand at the door. She'd go right back and start over. David Harris felt at the time that if everybody in America began to exercise what we're talking about, we'd live in an radically different society. Her son Gabriel says about his mother, she's very serious about what she does. She may have been serious, and maybe at the time she had some impact on the social and political agenda, but today, the change she implemented is not credited back to her and her work. Baez herself may even feel like she failed when it came to saving the lives of some of the American men who were shipped off to Vietnam. She shares, "Last year I went to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. I saw the wall. I wanted to put my hands on the wall. I wanted to go into it. I couldn't get close enough. And then I could feel it coming, and I started to scream." She saw those names on the wall and remembered all of the men who ignored her, who got on the bus, and died in Vietnam. She was often seen as a serious face. Roger McGinn says, "I saw her as this sort of pristine, prim and proper lady who stood for social causes. And then when I got to know her, and she let her hair down, and she was just wild and fun." Even her son Gabriel shares, she also really loves to laugh. But this is a side to Baez that America rarely saw. She was often so afraid of the stage, ironically she felt it was easier to have a relationship with 10,000 people than it was with one. She believes her stage fright was due to the fact that her fans put her on a pedestal and always expected her to have a message. She says, "Nobody knew it. Nobody saw my knees shake, and nobody saw what happened backstage before when I was a blob on the floor, not wanting to get up and walk. I was 48 years old, and I think it's probably the same for a lot of people who all of a sudden kind of think, I've had enough of this." But it was work, and it continued for a number of years, and lo and behold, the phobias began to dissipate, panic attacks started to go away, the insomnia started to vanish. And so, it was kind of like miracles. Relaxed and phobia-free, these days Joan Baez goes out on stage for the fun of it, without a political message. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, Baez helped shape the political agenda with her musical repertoire and nonviolent protest. In a profile of her on the CBS show Sunday Morning, commentator Charles Osgood said, "Her audiences today tend to be people old enough, so coming to hear Joan Baez helps them remember who they were all those years ago, until she makes them forget because of who she is now." She has constantly been changing her purpose over the years, but the common denominator among her causes is nonviolence. Other than that aspect to her life, she is always in motion, and that might be why it is difficult for some to pinpoint her successes. Unlike Bob Dylan, she has never sold out. She is now simply enjoying life, traveling, and finding peace within her own voice. New York Times writer Maureen Dode wrote of Dylan's tour in China, "Bob Dylan may have done the impossible, broken creative new ground in selling out." The idea that the raspy troubadour of the 60s, freedom anthems, would go to a dictatorship and not sing those anthems is a whole new kind of sellout. Even worse than Beyonce, Mariah, and Usher collecting millions to croon to Gaddafi's family, or Elton John breaking in a fortune to serenade gay bashers at Rush Limbaugh's 4th wedding. It might be that Joan has slipped through the cracks of our memories because she never insisted on receiving attention. She says, "I found it very important to not be burdened with any bigger ego than I had already had." Even though she was on the cover of Time magazine at the age of 21, she didn't consider herself a celebrity. In an interview, she described, "What fame actually is, I don't know, because I don't consider myself famous. I think there's a difference between being well-known and being famous. She went on to say, if we have to put labels on me, I would prefer the first label to be human being, the second label to be pacifist, and if we have to have a third, let it be folk singer. Ultimately, though, she feels my battle was, and in a way still is, how do I separate what they think I am from what I think I am, or what I am? Because they probably don't have much to do with each other. What I think Joan Baez is nothing short of a saint. I know that she would disagree, but Baez has risked her life time and time again, reached out to those less fortunate than her, and has never asked for anything in exchange. I myself am a member of today's youth. My relationship with Joan and her music has been growing stronger and stronger since I was a child. The first album I ever owned was the essential Bob Dylan. I memorized the lines to Blowing in the Wind and later discovered We Shall Overcome. When I discovered versions of these songs performed by Baez, I too, like Dylan, became obsessed with her voice. The causes of the 1960s and the 1970s to end violence and to clean up our planet became instilled in my mind so much that I even tried to prevent my local school district from cutting down a tree in exchange for a parking lot. And today, as Baez moves out of the public eye even more, my passion for nonviolence only grows stronger. I'm baffled that my generation does not know who she was or what she did to contribute to the social movements of her time. I believe that a possible explanation as to why Joan Baez is not identified with the social movements that she led was because of her race, her gender, and her demeanor. I believe that Joan would not only be identified with the civil rights movement, but praised for her work in advocacy for African Americans had she been a member of their community racially, like Dr. King and Rosa Parks. I also believe that if she had been a male, her voice would have had more of a difference, especially during the free speech movement and the peace movement. And lastly, she was never vague and never short with her words. She was blunt and she was honest in her belief that Americans feel that other countries' problems are our responsibility, and they're not. She challenged authorities at home and abroad, and because of it, at times, has been banned by the United States Army to perform to wounded soldiers. She has almost always been censored on television and even asked by officials to not visit or perform in certain countries around the globe. Reverend Jesse Jackson recalls she was with us and among us, and yet she was Joan Baez. And at the same time, she somehow maintained some form of normality. This is why she has slipped through the cracks of our society's memory an accurate depiction of history. She knew if you're committed to singing meaningful songs, you also have to be committed to leading a life that backs that up. Baez was committed to her causes, not to being famous. The causes are still there, but Baez has made the conscious decision that martyrdom is not for her. After 50 years of standing up for others, Joan Baez is taking a seat. In a way, she has done and achieved so much and nothing at the same time. After being imprisoned multiple times, had her life threatened because of what she believed, traveled to countless other countries, had a failed marriage, a son that felt she wasn't there for him, and had her heart torn out and stomped on by her soulmate Bob Dylan, it's probably safe to assume she's been worn out. This is why she has slipped from the limelight, has become unrecognizable as a political and social and musical icon by today's youth, and she has virtually returned to living the life of a normal American.